Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. Last month on this channel we looked at the history of Soul Calibur, the Soul Edge sequel that was released in arcades in 1998, with a superior home conversion arriving for the Sega Dreamcast in 1999. This weapons-based fighter innovated in so many ways and was graphically mind-blowing for a console game. In fact, Soul Calibur would be so impressive that it would garner some of the most positive critical reception of all time, becoming ranked up there with the likes of Final Fantasy VII and the Ocarina of Time. This Dreamcast game really did make that level of impact. So after far exceeding all expectations, how do you try to bloody top that? Well, in today's video, this is one of the very questions I'm going to try and answer for you. But it goes without saying that part of the answer to make a sequel to a game that was as well received as Ocarina of Time and Final Fantasy VII was simply to try and include the star characters from Ocarina of Time and Final Fantasy VII. Namco would go all out with this one, resulting in yet another classic. So without further ado, this, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Soul Calibur 2, the Namco fighting game with Link in it. Yeah! Functioning as a Sega Dreamcast launch title in North America, Soul Calibur, with its multiple perfect review scores, would take the world by storm, achieving good sales numbers despite the Dreamcast itself underperforming in the sales department. A great number of people who purchased the Dreamcast would also purchase Soul Calibur. Less than 1 year after the game's console release, it appeared that a sequel was already in the works. In fact, on January the 13th in the year 2000, IGN would report that reliable Japanese arcade super site Amusement Graffiti had revealed a big surprise, which IGN claimed to have stumbled upon when doing their daily online rounds that day. The site listed that Soul Calibur 2 would be arriving in the summer of that year, and was being programmed to run on Sega's Naomi arcade hardware, the arcade counterpart to the Dreamcast. IGN could not confirm whether this was an error on the site, or if the game truly was coming. They would however contact a Namco executive who would state to them he could not confirm nor deny that Soul Calibur 2 was in the works. If there was any truth to this story though, Namco seemed to at the very least drastically change direction, as while we would eventually get a Soul Calibur 2, it would not arrive until July of 2002, and that was just in the arcades, over 2.5 years after IGN published this article. Regardless, between these events it must have become clear to Namco that the Sega Dreamcast was no longer the future of gaming, with Sega discontinuing the platform on March 31st, 2001, with Sega withdrawing from the console business and restructuring itself as a third-party publisher. This meant that when it came to Soul Calibur 2, the arcade version of the game would not be developed to run on the Sega Naomi, but instead their Namco System 246 arcade board. Namco had found absolutely huge levels of commercial success with their Tekken series that had continuously seen home ports to the Sony PlayStation consoles. In fact, this would help Tekken become the most popular fighting game series of that generation. As covered on this channel last week, Tekken was developed to run on the Namco System 11 arcade board, a board with very similar architecture to that of the PlayStation, making the conversion of the game as smooth as possible. Soul Calibur 2's Namco System 246 board would prove similarly useful, as development of the hardware was based on the Sony PlayStation 2's technology, thus meaning converting the game to run on the Sony PlayStation 2 would have been a very simple process. In fact, it was not just the PlayStation 2 that Soul Calibur 2 would arrive on, but its competition as well, with Namco covering all bases, with the Nintendo GameCube and the Microsoft Xbox versions of the game arriving on the market as well. No longer would the Soul Calibur brand be restricted to a smaller market like with their previous outing on the Dreamcast. What made this multi-platform release all the more interesting was that Namco would work to broker a deal with other companies to provide guest characters for the game that would be of interest to each system's user base. Most famously, Namco would broker a deal with Nintendo to include Link from the Legend of Zelda series, a movie in which Nintendo fans would absolutely fall in love with. The plan was for owners of a Sony PlayStation 2 to be able to play as Cloud Strife in the game from Final Fantasy VII, another iconic video game character who wields a sword. Sadly, it is said that the deal that the company made with Square fell through at the last hurdle, which meant that in a last-ditch effort he would be replaced with Heihachi from the Tekken series, which, while nowhere near as cool as getting Cloud in the game, was still better than a slap in the face. The strangest of the 3 console exclusive characters in my opinion would be the inclusion of Image Comics' Spawn in the Microsoft Xbox version of the game. I guess back then the Xbox brand was way too new for the Xbox to have any characters who were associated with it. So considering that back then the whole brand appears to be marketed towards edgy teens and nerdy young adult males, they would be given a comic book character for their fighting game, which they could enjoy while swigging their Mountain Dew with their Duke controller in their fat, Cheeto dust covered hands. Yeah. Personally, I purchased a Sega Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, Nintendo GameCube and Microsoft Xbox that generation, arguably making me one of the biggest nerds of all. But thinking about it, whoever the marketing team were working at Microsoft at the time, they were gunning hard to cater to that incel demographic. It certainly wasn't about creating inclusive consoles that appealed to as wide a market as possible back then. The Xbox was made for the core gamer. Basically the typical shut-in. Hilarious tangents aside, no matter which system you went for, fortunately everyone had access to Soul Calibur 2. Like Soul Calibur on the Dreamcast, programming of the title would be led by Shinobu Nimura, who in an old interview outlines what it was like programming the game to run on multiple different platforms. He would describe the systems as the playful PS2, the balanced GameCube and the powerful Xbox. Adding, in a way, PS2 is almost an Asian style console. The consoles all have great potential and it's up to the programmers to tap into this potential. In that way, the PS2 is very interesting to program for and has a playful aspect. Well, if you're going to come out and say it is difficult, but if looking on the bright side, it's pretty interesting. And so I feel that it's a hardware that sucks in those developers with an adventurous spirit. As for the GameCube, it would almost be a European style, an old style console. You can tell it's the console of a hardware maker that has been making consoles for a long time. Stuff like the layout of the memory and other things just end up being easy to use. You wouldn't think it looking at the specs, but when you use it, it ends up getting quite decent performance. It's a nice hardware without any excesses. I think the common verdict that its balance is good is ultimately correct. It's fairly easy to use things like compression, so we shrunk various stuff to get it in there to obtain our results. With the Xbox, it's just a brute overwhelming power. It would be a waste not to use all that power, so we have done things like make it D4 compatible, splash on full screen anti-aliasing, etc. When companies design game consoles from now on, in terms of efficiency and whatever, they will probably look at Xbox as the standard. Like previous entries in the series, Soul Calibur 2 would be developed by Namco's Project Soul team, which once again would see Hiroki Yotoriyama at producer helm. Prior to Soul Calibur 2's release, he would be interviewed by IGN about the process. He would state that when developing the game, it was about making adjustments in order to create a game that is both more enjoyable and pleasant for the end user. The team at the time were trying very hard to balance out consumer demand and what they personally wanted to accomplish as developers. With Soul Calibur 2, the goal was to expand the definition of a 3D fighting action game in terms of its freedom involving the usage of space and weapons. The game we would eventually get, first released in arcades on July 10th, 2002, would include all of these things and much more. Like previous entries in the series, the title would feature a plot that revolves around the legendary weapon known as Soul Edge. In this one, Soul Edge, having been shattered into pieces, has different characters seeking out to collect all of the pieces to gain possession of the complete weapon, or to destroy it once and for all. This story takes place in 1590 AD, chronologically occurring 4 years after the events of Soul Calibur on the Dreamcast. As intriguing of a story that Soul Calibur 2 would bring to the table, obviously what really mattered would be the gameplay. So what would this sequel bring along with it? As for the combat, key game system improvements include an easier step and avoid system, making the action in the game even more fluid than with the previous series installment. Arena walls would also be introduced, replacing ring out on all sides like in the prior game. An extra mechanic that would be built off the back of this was that now wall specific moves would also become executable, adding to the weapon wielding mayhem. We would also see the introduction of a new 3-step soul charge system and a clash system, whereby when 2 attacks hit each other simultaneously, it results in a white flash. Dazzling. A new guard block system would also be introduced, which would see attacks which put a blocking player into a post guard impact state, The guard impact system was also revised, with it removing height-based impact moves, and instead using a more unified system where high and mid attacks can be countered using repels, and mid and low attacks can be countered using parries. Like most fighting games, we would get many familiar modes returning, such as an arcade mode, a versus battle, a team battle, time attack, survival, and practice mode. In the game's arcade mode, the 7th match is known as a destined battle. These are predefined matches that never change, as according to each character's story, they each have a rival who they take on in the destined encounter. Interestingly, a feature that was dropped from Soul Calibur, but included in Soul Edge at an earlier date, makes a return in this game, the inclusion of extra weapons being available. These additional weapons are simplified though compared to the earlier game, with stats offering up 3 different groups of attributes: attack value, defense value, and special abilities. For example, some weapons can be used to drain energy, whereas others can be used to pass through an opponent's set defense. This means that each fighter in the game can wield a total of 12 different weapons, from very basic ones to their powerful ultimate weapon. Other weapon variants include characters' weapons from Soul Edge, and silly joke ones offering terrible stats, stupid sound effects, and more. Each weapon also offers up a backstory of their own, which can be looked up within the game's weapon gallery. The game has a large roster of fighters, with some fighters having as many as 6 different costumes, so pair this all with the game's weapon variety, there is a hell of a lot of room for customization. As for the weapons in the game, they feed into this title's Weapon Master mode, made in a similar fashion to Soul Edge's Edge Master mode, and Soul Calibur's Mission mode. This part of the game features a story with the player moving around the map divided into regions and fighting enemies, gaining experience points. This XP can then be used to raise characters' ranks, and money can be accumulated to purchase weapons, costumes, and video sequences. The mode has 10 main chapters, 4 sub-chapters, and 2 extra chapters, as well as extra missions. This all in all gives Soul Calibur 2 some extra replayability and a good reason to return to this game time and time again. A huge appeal of Soul Calibur 2, or any fighting game for that matter, is obviously the game's roster of colourful characters themselves. Now, we have already gone through the console exclusive lineup, but what about the rest of this game's cast? Many characters who have appeared in previous Soul Calibur games will be brought back, as well as Tekken's Yoshimitsu, as an unlockable, a swordsman who fits in this game like a glove. Further to this, 4 completely new playable characters would be included to players from the get-go, consisting of Cassandra, who has a fighting style derived from Sophitia, there is a French nobleman named Raphael, a priestess named Talim, and Yunsung, a character with a fighting style derived from Huang. Further from this, a new unlockable character would be introduced named Charade, who switches its style to match existing characters' move lists with each individual round of fighting. The console versions of the game would also feature Necrid, a new character created by Todd McFarlane, the writer and artist of the superhero horror fantasy series Spawn, which explains more as to why that character was in the Xbox version of the game. So there was obviously more to it than catering to those with Cheeto dust covered hands. In regards to the character's fluid motions and combat techniques in the game's producer, Yotoriyama, states it was all made possible with the use of motion blending, adding, motion blending has been used in other games already, but it's basically mixing 2 separate movements into one. So you have the upper part of the body showing the character swinging the whip, and the lower part of the body showing the character running, and we basically put the 2 of them together. For example, Ivy walking while she's swinging her whip, or walking while she's in fighting stance, gives it a more aggressive look. As mentioned previously in the video, the last Soul Calibur game would earn its spot in history as one of the most positively received video games of all time. So with this next entry in the series that looked to build and improve further on that experience, how would reception be this next time around? The console version of the game would arrive in the West in the summer of 2003, with IGN writing the game we have all been waiting for has arrived. They would also write Soul Calibur was born on the ill-fated Dreamcast and has over the years aged remarkably well. From initial shock to a deeper felt love to fond nostalgic memories, Soul Calibur set a new standard for weapons-based fighting games, and perhaps even fighting games themselves. But did anyone expect that a first generation Dreamcast title would sustain its steady hold over the genre for so long? We didn't. Almost 4 years after the original Soul Calibur release, we finally come face to face with a game that can not only be considered a worthy peer, but a worthy beneficiary to the mighty throne that has seen but one ruler in recent years, its sequel, Soul Calibur 2. The simple fact of the matter is Soul Calibur 2 is the best weapons-based fighter out there, period. It's also one of the best games in the fighting genre itself. There's a diverse selection of characters, a deep fighting system, a decent single player mode, and the multiplayer is as fun as it ever was. The problem, if that's what you want to call it, is that Soul Calibur on Dreamcast was at the time of its release an almost monumental achievement and breakthrough in fighting games. Soul Calibur 2 is essentially more of the same great stuff that made its predecessor the genre-defining game that it was, but in the context of the present day and the corresponding competition, the impact of such a game has been greatly reduced. Does that mean Soul Calibur 2 is old, outdated, and even obsolete? Absolutely not. What it does mean is that Soul Calibur did a lot of things right the first time, and ironically, that works against the sequel to a degree. And so, while evolution is not always mandatory, sometimes pushing the boundaries can lead to bigger and better things. In the case of Soul Calibur 2, contentment will do just fine. GameSpot would give a similar opinion of the game, writing, "By definition, one cannot improve upon perfection." So considering that 1999 Soul Calibur for the Dreamcast is widely considered to be a flawless fighting game, maybe that explains why Namco didn't take many risks with the sequel, which has finally hit the PlayStation 2, Xbox and GameCube. If nothing else, Soul Calibur 2 is proof of how outstanding 1999 Soul Calibur really was. Like its predecessor, this sequel can provide countless hours of fast-paced, great-looking battles, though if you played a lot of the previous Soul Calibur game, you'll be hard-pressed to sustain or even muster up the same level of enthusiasm over this update. That's not to say Soul Calibur 2 doesn't pack in any thrills of its own. It's certainly one of the most refined, most accessible and best looking 3D fighting games to date, and it's squarely the best game in its class for the Xbox and GameCube. To put it simply, the closest thing to criticism that Soul Calibur 2 would receive was just the fact that it was not as revolutionary as the previous Soul Calibur game. But that did not stop the game receiving mass critical acclaim of its own. Average review scores put the game at 92.3% on the GameCube, 91.3% on the PS2, and 91.6% on the Xbox, and you can't ask for much more than that. Further to this, in the first ever Spike Video Game Awards in 2003, Soul Calibur 2 won in the category of Most Addictive Game, and by 2007 the GameCube version sold about 1 million copies in the US and 100,000 in Japan, making it one of the best-selling third-party GameCube games in existence. I wonder if this has any link to Link. The game would sell millions and millions of copies, eclipsing sales of the previous Dreamcast exclusive. Once again, the Soul Calibur franchise has proved to the world that it was one of the most important fighting game franchises in existence, and a key fixture in console gaming that generation. So with that said, ladies and gentlemen, that was the story of Soul Calibur 2. So let me know in the comment section down below what you thought of this episode, and if you want to see me cover Soul Calibur 3 down the line. There are plenty of fighting game retrospectives like this one on the channel for you to go back and enjoy in the meantime. Videos like this are in part made possible due to the amazing individuals who back my work over on Patreon, so huge thank yous go out to A Murder of Crows, Carl Johnson, Sebastian Velez, Heyo, Paulo Lopez, Nostalgia Collector, Ben Harradine, Corey Omar Sr., Ron Dinched, Evan Border, Philip Manth, Azur Arkai, Dropkin Varela, Michael Calix, Ego, Jordan Durant, Ian Boyle, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Johnny Holly, August Piazza, Justin Wang, Capcom vs SNK, Hermes Gonzalez, Man Shovel, Michael Hall, Sang Hee, Norma Stitz, Langston Miller, Noob, Sarah Powell, Flamic Renee, Marvin Araliga, TOG Driver, Louis Viant, John Bates, David Bale, Chris Fisk, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Synth Spaces, Punk Toast, Steve, Awesome Jacket Dude, and everybody else who backs my work over on the Patreon platform. Thank you for being a part of the most exclusive club on all of YouTube. But anyone can join, so is it exclusive really? So just shut the hell up and become one of my Patreon backers. That'd be much appreciated. Thank you. Bye.